So before we get into things, I'd just like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the folks on the slide. I would assume most people probably recognize Tim Leary. But next to him is Eldridge Cleaver. And the reason that Eldridge Cleaver is here, this is actually a photo when they were both in Algiers after Leary had been busted out of jail by the Weather Underground. And so it seems really fitting for some of the issues that I would like to dive into to sort of highlight these radical histories within psychedelic spaces, because it seems like within the more recent so-called resurgence of psychedelia, we've lost track of a lot of the radical foundations for psychedelic and countercultural movements. And so I'd like to have that theme running through this talk. I think it is. But having had a few folks who were asking me who that person was prior to the talk, I thought it was a good moment to make that acknowledgement and also illustrative of some of the histories that we've lost. So with that being said, I'd like to kind of just dive right in. We're going to start with this notion that you may have heard of dosing the water. So this was actually sort of a result of psychedelic politics at the 1968 Democratic Convention. Essentially, this was a ploy by the media-savvy yippies. That was it was one component of a much broader political campaign that included all sorts of attempts at overwhelming the media apparatus as it existed, trying to be as sensationalist as possible. And Abby Hoffman pretty much figured that making this claim of putting LSD in the water supply was a great way to get people's attention and make them think about what might be going on. Now, that was only taken seriously by a couple of politicians who ended up deploying troops out to the various water towers to make sure that LSD didn't wind up in there. Obviously, they weren't very familiar with the fact that it wasn't a feasible plan. Many folks at the time were sort of laughing about this strategy and the fact that it got any attention, but I think it offers a really interesting cultural reference point, this notion of dosing the water. And it's one that I think has really transcended the original historical and political context of the '68 convention. So if we understand dosing the water to be a cultural shorthand, I think we should understand that to be this notion of influencing society through drug experiences. And the thing about the way that it emphasizes influencing society, it seems to be through this notion of individual experiences, or the neoliberal individual as a consumer in the marketplace, as someone who is capable of making choices on their own and then somehow those choices rippling out. We see that through the article on the bottom right. If everyone tripped on psychedelics, we'd do more about climate change, which does absolutely nothing to acknowledge the systemic components of capitalism, industrial civilization, and the other factors that are contributing to climate crisis. So I think if we actually unpack this notion of dosing the water or mass change through psychedelics, we can see that it operates on faith rather than evidence. And I think there are really good reasons why that faith exists there, right? If we want to ask why are psychedelics significant, we can actually run through a pretty interesting list. So I think most folks who have had psychedelic experiences could call out some potential as catalysts for personal change, and likely as a result of those personal experiences may get some sort of sense or notion that, gee, if everybody could tap into this, think about what we could do as a society. But if we actually look at the way this research is taking place within a social context, we can see that there's huge potential as maintenance therapies for perpetuating the US war machine. The fact that there's been an explicit focus on MDMA for PTSD, the fact that we see skyrocketing rates of PTSD in drone operators who actually live within, in many cases, within regular society, drive onto bases, fly sorties over countries all around the world, many of whom we're not actually at war with, we can see some really potentially dastardly applications for this and quite a bit of money to be thrown around that as well. Additionally, we see the potential as maintenance therapies for people suffering from industrial capitalism. So this notion that you might have heard from certain therapists about, one dose, two dose, treatments where people are cured of their depression. Well, if you live within industrial capitalism, if you are working multiple minimum wage jobs in order to barely stay above the poverty line, the notion that a single dose of psilocybin is somehow going to correct your material circumstances seems not so likely. So again, we see this potential for maintenance therapies, which could be ongoing and raise a lot of questions about how we do healthcare. Additionally, I would contend that we see a lot of potential for economic engines, right? Both psychedelics on their own, either as therapies when we're talking about treating things like treatment-resistant depression, which has something like 300 million sufferers worldwide and is rising, but also if we look at a lot of the strategies that are being proposed for dealing with this, there's a high potential for data capture and the relationships that we see in surveillance capitalism when firms like Amazon or Google or Facebook utilize our metadata or other, in some cases, biological data in order to sell targeted ads to advertisers, right? To sell space where they can project who might click on an ad at a certain time based on the behavioral information they have for you. They've highlighted biomedical research or the biomedical arena as a particularly ripe spot for surveillance capitalism. And I think it's not a mistake that we're seeing an increasing number of surveillance capitalist firms associated with psychedelics. And so finally, I would contend that psychedelics are significant because the experiences they can facilitate are inherently political. And that runs counter to a lot of the narratives from folks like Rick Doblin or Ben Sessa, who might argue that these things are in fact apolitical. And the reason that I would contend that we should be looking for the political components in these psychedelic experiences is because even if we look at the most hippy-dippy notions that come out of this, right? If you have an experience where you get the sense that love is all there is and that you are a complete whole human being, and then you come back to a world where there are trillions of dollars in ad spends designed to tell you that you're unlovable and incomplete unless you buy the right deodorant, the right toothpaste, wear the right clothes in order to fit in with friends and family, it seems like there's an inherent political tension there. Similarly, if you have an experience, say you fall in love with a tree or recognize that ecological systems are really important if we want to survive on this planet, and then you come back to a world where industrial civilization is literally in the process of making the planet uninhabitable, again, it seems that there's a pretty clear political tension here. So too, if we look at the importance of play or connection, the notion that life is but a dream, don't take yourself so seriously, and then we come back to these commodified social and labor relationships where the way that we relate to our fellow beings is actually through market forces. It's through the ways that we're forced to sell our labor. It's through these games that actually seem to come with a lot of life and death costs when we look at the costs of industrial civilization and what it means to be a wage slave in this context. And so finally, to return to these really hippy-dippy notions, right, this I am you and you are me and we are all together, well, I don't really think that we can live that or experience that when we come back to this atomized society within the context of capitalism. So if we believe in the values or if we have experiences that tend to orient us towards these values, it seems like we have very real political projects to engage in when we come back to the here and now, at least if we're interested in doing something with that. Similarly, if we look at a history of why drugs are illegal in the US, we can see that this is largely for political reasons. So we have notions of white supremacy, right? This old quote that said, the primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races, or the fact that there were numerous police departments that were putting in for extra large caliber bullets in order to stop cocaine-crazed Negroes. We have John Ehrlichman, advisor to Nixon, saying, did we know drugs weren't an issue? Of course we did. What we did is we recognized that we couldn't make it illegal to be black or against the war, but we could associate blacks with heroin and hippies with marijuana. And by doing that, we could criminalize their leaders, vilify them on the nightly news, raid their houses, and otherwise interfere with them, right? So they had a clear sense of what they were doing as a political project, not as a harm reduction, not as a human rights and safety issue around these drugs. This was purely political. Similarly, we can see the same thing with this Nixon quote, misogynistic Nixon quote, about how homosexuality, dope, immorality in general are the enemies of strong societies, where this notion of sexual orientation and drugs are both presented as politically undesirable and therefore legitimate to eradicate from society. And if we look at the drugs that generally get used and encouraged within capitalism, we see that psychedelics, generally speaking, aren't particularly good for industrial manufacturing. I would say it's not really a surprise that at the point where folks have figured out how to market psychedelics not as boundary-dissolving agents that challenge the standard socioeconomic order, but rather as microdoses that you might actually be able to use to make your coders more efficient and increase profitability, of course now capitalism has said, there's a place for LSD in this society. So based on that, we should understand that there are these signifiers around legitimacy and authority, and that if we look at dominant culture and the state, fundamentally they're predicated on coercion and violence. The way that psychedelics have been criminalized have been done along political lines and have ultimately targeted minorities and folks who don't fit into the established socioeconomic order. Additionally, I would contend that authority, whether we're talking about states or parents, is not necessarily self-justifying. So if somebody says that you can't do something, they should be able to provide a solid, logically sound reason why you can't do that. If they're unable to justify that authority, I would say it's indefensible and should be dissolved. And so if we look at psychedelics, we can see that they weren't criminalized by accidents or based on any empirical evidence or scientific data. And so as a result, we should understand that psychedelics belong in the public domain and that pretty much all applications of psychedelics should be viewed as equally legitimate. There has been this sort of move towards a prohibitionist light stance by certain researchers who are arguing for limited legalization or decriminalization and arguing for their own continued sole dominion over psychedelics. I would say, again, it doesn't really hold up, but that's an argument that seems to support mainstreaming. And I would suggest that mainstreaming is ultimately this notion of respectability politics meant to assuage dominant culture, where by showing that our values are continuous with those of dominant culture, somehow that makes us acceptable, right? The main problem is that in many cases our values may not be continuous with those of white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, industrial civilization, etc. So that therefore requires the whitewashing or homogenization of marginalized perspectives, where if you are somebody who can't show your values as being continuous with dominant culture, well then you're not really capable of engaging in the necessary respectability politics and therefore should be, if not eradicated from the space, your voice doesn't really belong here. We find that you're being too negative, we find you're being a Debbie Downer, and ultimately we'd like you to take your criticisms and leave. Similarly, we see the commercialization of substances. This is when we're talking about capitalism, everything functions on the marketplace. In order for psychedelics to fit in within a mainstream capitalist paradigm, they need to function as market commodities. And so at the end of the day, we ultimately see the flattening and commodification of culture, where in order for us to participate in these spaces, we have to drop many of the reasons that we were maybe called to these spaces. For example, if you've had experiences that were incredibly empowering because you have always been marginalized within the components and confines of dominant culture, and suddenly the main actors within psychedelic space are now telling you, actually all of the liberatory potential you found here is really upsetting to dominant culture, so we're gonna need you to be quiet. There's not really a way for you to participate. Similarly, we see this in, for example, if you take the MAPS newsletter or MAPS emails, which maybe sign off with something like support psychedelic science. In that context, support psychedelic science is understood to mean give money to MAPS. However, if we actually think about the ways that you can support psychedelic science, there's a variety of things that you can do both on your own and with other people that can really advance a plurality of psychedelic sciences well beyond giving money to MAPS. And maybe you don't have particularly considerable resources from which to give money. There is a variety of other ways for you to participate, and in ways that don't necessarily reinforce those institutional perspectives. But that's all lost when we actually look at that sort of communication. So it should be apparent by now that I think the mainstream is a mistake. Ultimately, I would contend that dominant culture literally presents an existential threat to human life on this planet. And we can't really make use of psychedelics if we're all dead. So if we want to actually implement these things in ways that challenge dominant structures and culture, we're not going to be able to Trojan horse our way in as a component of dominant culture, to my mind. And frankly, if this was an effective strategy, I've been asking the folks who are championing this for years to provide either historical or peer-reviewed evidence that they can support their political and social assertions. I would imagine if I walked into a chemistry lab with a similar amount of evidence about beliefs on chemistry, I would get laughed out. Yet for some reason, these folks have been able to establish and stick with narratives that actually have no social or political or historical basis, and nobody's really questioned whether or not the emperor is wearing any clothes. So I would contend if there is no evidence, we're ultimately talking about meaningless propaganda, or I would frame it as dose the water 2.0. Whereas dose the water the first time was sort of this prank, this notion that, if we just give enough psychedelics to people, we'll change society. Now I would say it's the notion that if we can just put psychedelics into every therapist's office, well, as people have their individual therapeutic experiences, somehow society will change socially and politically on the back of that. I would say also we've seen the rise of the integration industry, right? So I mentioned medicalization and pseudo-medicalization in the first point, but the integration industry functions in this really interesting way where it's sort of a wink and a nudge that psychedelics can be found here, where integration has begun to mean everything from actually helping people make sense of their psychedelic experiences to giving people psychedelics and facilitating experiences. And I would say, especially as we're at this point of bringing a lot of awareness to psychedelic compounds, and as there have been a lot of more mainstream narratives that have gone out there, this sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like we can continue to perpetuate these values through some sort of pseudo-medicalized approach, I don't think really holds up, and I don't think necessarily results in some of the change people might suspect on the, off the cuff. And again, because it's individually focused rather than systemically engaged, we're finding that either people are with practitioners where they're having experiences that they don't necessarily know how to make meaning of, or we're seeing experiences where people are perhaps very naive and are become new sort of psychedelic acolytes looking to spread this gospel of, gee, if we can just turn enough people on, things will change. And ultimately, I would contend, we see over and over and over again the operation on faith and slogans rather than evidence. I've literally had people refer to or reply to meticulously researched articles that I've published with the statements of, stop being so angry, we're here for an evolution, not a revolution. And, I don't really think that that holds water in the marketplace of ideas. So if we're talking about this issue of sloganeering, we can see this in mainstream culture. This quote by Noam Chomsky, I think, really makes a great point, where he says, "The point of public relations slogans like support our troops is that they don't mean anything. That's the whole point of good propaganda. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about." And now, if we bring this over to the psychedelic realm, we find some really interesting propaganda going on. Now, before we jump into it specifically, I'd like to take a moment and remind folks that in the US, the modern police force actually traces a direct lineage from Southern slave-catching gangs and Northern watches that were tasked with removing undesirable elements from the streets. That was namely things, immigrants, prostitutes, vagrants, folks who weren't particularly wealthy. And if we can actually trace an unbroken lineage from, again, slave-catching gangs to the modern police force. So this fixation on cops and veterans and service people as the ideal kind of people who deserve or should be treated with psychedelics raises a lot of questions about social tensions and relations. And this quote is from an interview Rick Doblin did in Bloomberg in 2018, following up a session where he had engaged in some sort of pseudo-therapeutic MDMA for PTSD and somebody who showed up at his Burning Man camp. And he said, "The fact that it was both a veteran and a retired police officer, the same person, it just made me think that this is the ideal kind of person we're trying to show. If we're trying to mainstream psychedelics, you know, what's more mainstream than a veteran and a police officer?" Now, I would contend, if we're going by the numbers alone, the population that those folks are deployed against are actually a lot more mainstream than cops or veterans or military personnel. And I would also suggest that if we look at the types of political motivations behind neighborhood occupations by police or military interventions by the US, I would suggest that the populations that these sorts of people are being deployed against are likely much more deserving of the focus of psychedelic therapies and of trying to actually pick apart the complex social and political dynamics that put them in that position in the first place. And so ultimately, I would contend that social peace is an illusion. And by this, what I mean that the apparent stability of daily life is predicated on violence. For those of us who have enough privilege to function in the world, we find that, you know, we could look out on the streets and say, well, nobody's rioting, so we have police. Never mind that we have tons of homeless folks, tons of vacant houses, tons of starving folks, tons of food waste that's ultimately escorted to the dump, potentially by armed guards on some occasions, right? The reason that we have these sorts of inequities is because we have cops and laws and systems that ultimately function to stand between people and their needs. That in order for capitalism to function as a system, those inequalities need to be enforced, otherwise things start to lose their value. I would contend that because these things are systemic, because these things are not just the results of individuals acting in a self-interested way, but actually run into all sorts of institutions and components that have been structured to enforce and reinforce these systems, unless we engage in a systemic critique of those components, we can't actually understand what's going on. And so unless we're able to get into understandings of intersections of race, class, gender, and the history around these components, I don't think we're actually going to be able to advance any coherent socio-political theorization. So when we look at some of the social and political thought that's coming out from the major institutions in this space, I think the lack of systemic engagement is part of the reason why they come up so short. To put this another way, it feels important to underscore that cops, military enlistees, and the fraction of the 1% don't actually have the same interests as those that they arrest, murder, and exploit. And while this makes a lot of folks uncomfortable in psychedelic spaces because there's some notion that we should all be able to love each other and we should all be able to exist in a non-antagonistic way, when some of us are literally stepping on the necks of the rest of us, it makes it really hard to get along. And I think if we're not willing to look those realities in the face and actually ask ourselves what we can do about them, we're gonna find ourselves a little bit stuck. And to go on for just a moment more on capitalism, I just want to point out that the starting capital for American capitalism was slavery and genocide. That's just the reality of things. That history has sort of traced its path to where we are today. And so when we talk about capitalism, it shouldn't be seen as an abstraction that just kind of floats out there and somehow dictates our social relations, but that actually consists of these really living and alive social histories that are rich with trauma and rich with all sorts of dispossession. And ultimately, where we are today, you can't opt out of things. People with superior firepower have roped off the commons and declared it theirs. You can't actually opt out of participating in the state. You're under their enforcement. I mean, just look at how some of the free man on the land arguments go when they actually wind up in court. So when people start saying that can't we buy ourselves out of these binds with psychedelics and capitalism, can't we actually find a way to use capitalism for good, one of the questions that I would have for them is, what's the body count of a hospital? I think most of us here could agree that modern medicine is probably if not the greatest good, one of the greatest goods that industrial civilization and capitalism has to offer. But if we look at hospitals, say the hospital by me runs off of a coal-fired power plant. So that requires blowing up mountains in West Virginia, transporting the coal, at the same time polluting all of the air and water, despoiling the ecosystem. At the same time, you need rare earth metals for your fMRI, MRI, CAT scan, things like that. So those are mined and refined in China by people who are never going to get to see the benefits of those technologies. They're shipped worldwide via logistics networks that require all sorts of other resources. We see the disposables, all the plastics, all the syringes, all of the little bits and pieces that get used for the hospital, the concrete that makes up the hospital, the CO2 emissions from that, the liquid oxygen, the computers. You can run through the whole thing. And at the end of the day, I think it illustrates the fact that even with the greatest good that industrial civilization or capitalism has to offer, we can see it offers a tiny benefit, or offers a huge benefit to a tiny minority at the expense of a vast majority. And I know as somebody who's fortunate to have a sliver of healthcare through the Affordable Care Act, even I get to take advantage of a very minor piece of that. Another question worth asking is, if mining and refining operations were purely voluntary, how much technology could we have? Could you have your phone? Could you have your laptop if the only way that someone was allowed to set up a mine or a refinery was if the people who actually lived on that land consented to it? Not down the barrel of a gun, not as a result of corporate legislation, but freely and genuinely. I would contend we'd have a lot less technology. And so ultimately, I think that commodification isn't the answer when we look to psychedelics. The sorts of social relationships that capitalism forces us into actually don't offer much potential for liberation or getting ourselves free from the sort of social relations we may find completely antithetical to our psychedelic experiences. And ultimately, I think that when we look at the core relations of these systems, it seems really important to get out of them. So with that being said, I think it bears looking at what motivates corporadelic or corporate psychedelic actors. I would contend money. I've contended this repeatedly, and people have gotten kind of upset with that. They say, hey, Dave, can't you offer us anything more than that? So in an attempt to do that, here we go. I think there's also optics, because good optics equates to more money. I think that there's this notion of building a good marketing or brand narrative, because if you have a compelling narrative, you get more money. I think there's this notion of scalability, finding markets that have an acute need, because if you can find a bigger market, again, you make more money. And ultimately, we see this diversification into other avenues towards increased profits, whether we're talking about military contracts or surveillance capitalism and data mining, regulatory capture, where maybe you become the first player on the field or one of the first players on the field, so you're able to set up what the regulatory frameworks look like to advantage yourself. All of these things are ultimately strategies towards maximizing profits. And I know that plenty of people don't believe me, so here's a really brief look through some of the recent media. Here's an article on Field Trip Ventures wanting drugs like LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA to become the, quote, new wave of the path that's been created by cannabis. Similarly, Christian Angermeyer of Atai Life Sciences talked about wanting to break the, quote, virgin market of psychedelics wide open. If we talk about optics, here's a panel that was that involved 3 people from Compass Pathways, which is a private company looking at developing psilocybin therapies. They essentially ran a sponsored content panel at MAPS Psychedelic Science 2017, giving them the pretty great optics of being insiders in the MAPS conference. If we talk about brand narratives, this is also from Compass, this article that was titled, "Two Parents Fight to Set Up the Largest Ever Magic Mushroom Trial for Depression is Nearly Over." And yeah, I would say the notion of having a depressed son who couldn't get better off of anything, and so you started looking towards psilocybin sounds like a really compelling narrative, until you look at the history and see that George and Katya, the 2 founders of the company, were actually exploring a psychedelic hospice and spa on the Isle of Man well before they were talking about any sort of psilocybin for their son. So it raises pretty significant questions about how cynical they are and what's actually going on. Additionally, back to Christian Angermeyer, after acknowledging that depression alone affects some 300 million people around the globe, he quotes, "Even if it takes just a single dose of psilocybin to treat depression, and I'd be very, very happy if that's the case, the medical unmet need is huge," Angermeyer said. "The market is growing for better or worse." I would suggest he thinks it's for better. Additionally, we can see these issues, this article about Trump's praise puts drug for vets on fast track. This was dealing with Johnson & Johnson's S-ketamine product Spravato. So we can see that the exploration of government or military contracts by having relations with the president and the VA is actively happening. Similarly, this article, California tests mental health app that tracks everything patients do on their phones. Well, this app is MindStrong Health. MindStrong Health slogan may as well be the smartphone app that knows you're depressed before you do. They're a Compass Pathways partner that is looking to leverage predictive AI in order to understand what your mental health is like. Now, as this article notes, they track everything that you do on your phone. I would contend that there's a good bit of incentive to sell that data simply because this is the arena that is rapidly expanding under surveillance capitalism. There's a huge financial incentive to making that data available, and whether we look at firms like Google or Facebook or any of the other Amazon major surveillance capitalism firms, pretty much all of them have lied about what they're doing with that data, despite numerous assurances that they're not doing exactly what they are doing around selling that information. Similarly, here is an article titled "China Enters Magic Mushroom Industry, Wuhan, MJ MedTech, and M2 Bio." So MJ MedTech and M2 Bio, it's part of the Wuhan group, and the CEO is saying, just like it took time for the regulators to get behind marijuana, we believe the same will happen with magic mushrooms in due course. We want to be far ahead of the curve and become pioneers in the market, collaborating with legislative bodies to help find better and healthier solutions. So as we've seen around a number of the American firms, there's this push to be on really good terms with the regulators, because by being on good terms with the regulators, you hopefully get to steer what some of the regulations look like. And if you can push those regulatory apparatus in a direction that gives you some advantage over your competition, there's no telling how far ahead you might be able to get as this terrain initially gets set up. Again, right now this is the Wild West. We've seen how that played out with cannabis. I would suggest we're going to see it in a major way with psychedelics. And I think the way that this is playing out around medicalization bears taking a closer look at some of the components of medicalization. So let's talk about the medical model. I would contend that the legitimacy of the medical community in relation to psychedelics is ultimately predicated on prohibitionist dynamics. So as we've already seen, there was no actual evidentiary or scientific basis for criminalizing psychedelics. So if the argument from therapists and medical professionals is one of, well, you know, you're right, these actually are Schedule I substances, they're really dangerous, but we're the medical professionals that are qualified to work with them, you've already accepted prohibitionist logic. You're already operating on those terms, which I think is I understand why that point gets seeded in order for people to pursue their licensure or their Schedule I permits, but underlying that, I think we need to be able to look at the dynamics at play. Additionally, the reason why many therapists seem to be incredibly excited about the potential of these compounds is that they would contend that in the individual, they approach a cure. Rather than giving the patient drugs that manage a variety of symptoms, instead they're able to give them treatment that seems to get to the heart of those symptoms, that seems to address the underlying causes. But if we look at the way these compounds are being deployed socially, we see that we're seeing more of a systemic symptom management, where we're patching up individuals and throwing them back into a sick society. And frequently when people ask, well, hey, what are we doing about the sick society? We're told that that's either beyond the scope of mental health professions or psychedelic research, or is too radical, or threatens the plan of mainstreaming and medicalization because it's hostile towards dominant culture. Again, that seems like a bit of a catch-22 or another unfortunate bind. I would also contend that medicine is and has been systemically racist and classist. We can see this if we look at the Tuskegee Airmen. We can see this if we look at the case of Henrietta Lacks. We can see this in innumerable cases across history, and I don't think that if we look at some of the struggles that MAPS has had, such as their Yukon site getting shut down that was going to be focused on issues of racial disparity. I mean, we have ongoing problems with getting studies or getting data or getting engagement in ways that actually seem to challenge some of the institutions of white supremacy. And I think we need to center and focus on that a little bit more, to say the least. Additionally, I would contend that psychedelics are not solely about curing ill people, but about making well people weller. The notion that, you can take drugs or supplements up to the point where you're a fixed static whole doesn't really track for me, whether you're talking about some sort of cognitive enhancer or something that just generally makes you feel better, or if we're talking about the desire to explore ontological possibilities and philosophical musings through psychedelics. I think that losing out on that potential to the medical model would be a shame. I think that these compounds offer really rich food for thought, and that not engaging in that is a missed opportunity. But I think perhaps least discussed and potentially most important on this is the fact that psychedelic therapists appear to be engaging in unethical and inappropriate behavior with their patients and clients. And so recently, you may have heard that MAPS announced that there had been an ethical violation by 2 of their former therapists. These were folks who were involved in the MAPS Phase 2 MDMA for PTSD research in Canada. And this quote, which I'll read in a second, actually comes from a talk that was given in 2016 by Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer. This quote is from Richard Jensen. And essentially what was revealed is that Jensen engaged in a sexual relationship with the client. Dreyer found out at some point but did not report that to MAPS. MAPS pretty much sat on this knowledge, it appears, for at least 8 months before making this fairly watered down statement. And in this talk called Cautionary Tales, MDMA and MDA in Psychotherapy, at one point Jensen said, "There was another subject in that study," referring to a study he'd done very early on, "a lovely young lady who became very sexualized in her relationship around the sessions. It got so intense, I remember the chairman of our department kind of walked by and saw her sitting with me and talking with me, and he picked up on the energy she was putting out, and he said, 'Richard, come here. I'm 20 years old.' He said, 'Gynecologists, they always have a co-therapist with them. They always have a nurse in the room whenever they examine someone. I want you to make sure that you always have somebody with you when you're with this patient.' Thank God, because she became more and more and more activated sexually and was able to work it through and was able to get through the process of therapy and get well. But I don't think I could have handled it. I really don't think I could have as a young therapist." And personally, I found that rather troubling, because I think that if you're concerned about your inability to contain yourself or your propensity to act out or engage in physical and inappropriate relations within a therapeutic context, you should probably remove yourself from being a therapist. Similarly, when this talk was given, a couple folks indicated that they had reported their concerns to MAPS. However, apparently those concerns were never addressed. Similarly, in this talk, Donna Dreyer stated, "There are abuses that I'm sure can happen because people become so vulnerable. Your judgment is so completely not there that can happen. I mean, people become very vulnerable. What kind of settings can we create that would make sure that people really heal in those instead of being re-traumatized?" And now, this talk, just to reiterate, was given, it appears, during the period of time in which Jensen was engaged in this inappropriate sexual relationship. And in this talk, he then goes on to state, "In the early 80s, when MDMA was not yet scheduled, I ran across unfortunately large numbers of people where there was sexual acting out and difficulties, where therapists would be involved with multiple patients sexually. I think that's a particular thing with phenethylamines. They need constant supervision, where therapists can come and talk about the real struggles that they're going through, and also co-therapist teams are really important to temper the tendencies to act things out." Again, I think this notion of there being tendencies to act things out sexually in therapeutic containers is really troubling. It's also not limited to what's going on in the here and now. Part of the reason the MAPS protocol includes two therapists is because of the actions of therapists named Ingrassi and DeLeo. There's an article by Torsten Passy dealing with the history of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, where he delves into some of those historical issues. However, coming back to the present, there was a lawsuit filed against Jensen and Dreyer. In response to that lawsuit, here are some points from Jensen's response. These are just a select few because they seemed particularly egregious to me. Point 9 was, he asserted, while there was interaction during this time between the plaintiff, that's the woman who was assaulted, and Dr. Jensen, theirs was not a doctor-patient relationship. Rather, they were participants within their respective roles in the research study. In other words, Jensen's not a doctor, he just plays one in the context of the research study. Point 16, an intimate and sexual relationship between the plaintiff and Dr. Jensen commenced in or about February 26th and continued, though not always consistently, until in or about May 2017. The intimate relationship was initiated by the plaintiff. At all material times, the plaintiff genuinely consented to the intimate relationship. Again, this is happening within the context of therapy. This is happening within the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. To my mind, the notion that the plaintiff can initiate or consent is totally ass backwards. The fact that Jensen is using these assertions in an attempt to insulate himself legally is incredibly disturbing, and I think raises a number of questions about the MAPS protocol, especially considering that it finishes, or this excerpt finishes with point 19, where he argues, at no time during the intimate relationship were the plaintiff and Dr. Jensen in a doctor-patient relationship. Alternatively, if they were, which is denied, the plaintiff nonetheless genuinely consented to the intimate relationship. So again, we have not a doctor just playing one for therapy. If that wasn't the case, nonetheless, the patient was actually the initiator here. So to me, that seems pretty problematic. And unfortunately, notions around propriety on the part of therapists have seemed to be rather astounding in certain cases as far as what has or hasn't been viewed as appropriate. So there was another case involving a therapist who was involved in the Yukon study who he was giving a presentation that was disrupted by a group of people who were chanting and claimed that he had hurt people sexually, him and another person who were presenting on that panel. In response to this, Nick Power and Will Sue authored a public letter that they posted on Facebook. In that letter, Dr. Will Sue asserted that the woman in question, she did express her preference to use protection, this is true, but dialogue about how condoms decrease pleasure and preferences led to consensual unprotected sex. I think it would also have been disrespectful to think she wasn't an adult capable of negotiating and saying no if she meant no. Again, this is somebody who was a lead therapist on an MDMA study. This is somebody who, when points were made about these behaviors, received significant support from a number of people in the community. This person is currently on the MAPS integration list. This person was on the MAPS integration list a year ago when I informed Rick Doblin and a room full of MAPS higher-ups at the CIIS conference on cultural and political perspectives that some of this stuff had gone on. We're here a year later, this person is still on the MAPS integration list, being referred to people as a safe resource for integrating their potentially difficult or challenging psychedelic experiences. Does that make sense to y'all? This is a third case that I want to touch on. I'm assuming y'all can't read the Facebook notice on the right. That's just there because that was the sole indication that any of this stuff had gone down. So this is Neil Goldsmith. He was one of the organizers of Horizons. Somebody commented at an event in Australia at the end of 2017 that there was a Harvey Weinstein-esque character in one of the American psychedelic institutions. Shortly thereafter, they acknowledged that the person that they were referring to was Neil Goldsmith. In April of 2018, He was let go from Horizons. The founder and director of Horizons, Kevin Balktick, stated that he found the reports to be both serious and credible enough to permanently terminate Dr. Goldsmith from all roles at the organization. So we are now here about 15 months after the termination. That Facebook post is the only notice that was posted anywhere. The Horizons organizers declined to put the statement on their website, declined to make any sort of announcement about it at their conference, declined to engage in even a basic acknowledgement of issues of consent and psychedelic substances at their 2018 Horizons conference, and have instead stated that they are done, they have washed their hands with it, and that for all intents and purposes, the matter has been resolved. Which is all well and good, except that there's this ongoing open-ended transformative justice process around Neil that, as I understand, hasn't actually resulted in any outcomes. It's still going on. The young women who have been asked to put up with this whole process have, in my opinion, been asked to bear both the social and emotional as well as the economic burdens of this process stretching on for over a year. So if we're going to call this process transformative and yet it's reproducing all of the same dynamics of dominant culture, of patriarchy, can we actually consider that to be transformative? And if we have these cycles of abuse going on and on over and over again, and it seems that there's a lack of political will to do anything about it, at least on the institutional level, I think the question becomes for all of us, what can we do about that? How do we arrange ourselves in ways that can not only safeguard against some of these behaviors, but also can attempt to get some sort of accountability, that can attempt to actually enact social consequences for bad actors? Because we're at a point in time where MAPS is talking about scaling up the number of therapists involved in MDMA-assisted therapy by about 300 folks. So my question is, what do we have in place to prevent potential creeps or manipulators or general bad actors from actually getting involved in this? If they're already seeing green lights that they don't have to worry about institutional pressure, if they see that things are getting swept under the rug, what sort of strategies can we actually put in place to keep ourselves and each other safe? I don't think these are abstract questions. I think that there are many people in these spaces, whether it's as a result of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, trips to the Amazon and engagement with nefarious practitioners around ayahuasca. There are 5-MeO DMT practitioners such as Octavio Rettig and Jerry Sandoval who've killed people, raped people, assaulted people. Like, these problems are not new. Many of the folks who are still around who were involved in the sort of second wave of psychedelics are in many cases aware of many of these histories and can point to the fact that these things have been ongoing. And the fact that they have been so ongoing, I think, should indicate to us that unless we're willing to take a more hardline stance against these behaviors, we're just going to keep seeing the same thing over and over and over again. So with that being said, I'd like to end with this little quote. I get asked a lot for solutions, and I would contend that my job here is not to provide solutions, but hopefully to ask questions where we can come together and see what makes sense for us in our communities where we live. I wouldn't contend to know what's best for each and every one of y'all. I wouldn't expect anyone here to know what's best for me. What I'd like to do is come into dialogue and figure out what we can do to support each other, to figure out who we have affinity with, and to start organizing along lines of affinity and relation and familiarity that actually make sense and feel liberatory. So when we see that all the different institutions and mechanisms of domination have in common, it becomes clear that our individual struggles are also part of something greater than us, something that could connect us. When we come together on the basis of this connection, everything changes. Not only our struggles, but also our sense of agency, our capacity for joy, the sense that our lives have meaning. All it takes to find each other is to begin acting according to a different logic. To change everything, start anywhere. And so I would suggest that rather than focusing on lowest common denominator politics of you take drugs, I take drugs, don't we all like drugs, we rather start looking towards the actual political affinities that we have towards each other. If somebody repeatedly evidences themselves to be an authoritarian and you identify as an anti-authoritarian, it probably doesn't make sense for you to share political space or projects with that person. There may be certain areas where you have some overlap, certain areas where the fact that you have affinity around drugs comes into play, perhaps on the dance floor, and maybe you can give each other space and coexist. But I think that there are plenty of examples of people being in the space that have really antagonistic agendas towards each other. And rather than trying to steamroll over that and make us all sort of one and needing to be happy with all of these people around us, I think we should accept that it's okay to disagree. I think it's okay to accept that we have fundamental disagreements about where we are, where we'd like to go, and how we should get there. And so rather than trying to ignore those differences and focus on the drugs, I think we should focus on those differences and figure out whether it's with the aid of drugs, whether it's as a result of experiences from drugs, whether it has nothing to do with drugs and we just like being in these spaces, I think we should find other people with whom we can work to build the worlds that we want to be in. Thank you.
Could you give me a simple explanation of what MAPS and COMPAS are? You use the terms repeatedly.
Yeah, sorry. And for what it's worth, there are zines in the back. They're available for donation. If you don't have any money, please just take them. But there are writings in there on MAPS and COMPAS. MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They could be seen as sort of the major psychedelic nonprofit institution currently acting in the space. Their focus is largely on MDMA for PTSD. However, they're also interested in a wide variety of other psychedelic medical research, including iboga, ayahuasca, psilocybin. Rick Doblin is their founder. He's been in the press quite a bit. COMPAS is a UK-based for-profit company that started as a UK-based nonprofit company, reached out to some psychedelic researchers, basically said, hey, we're looking to do nonprofit work around psychedelics, focusing initially on hospice on the Isle of Man. They flew Michael Pollan out there. They flew a number of researchers out there. Shortly thereafter, they ended up changing course a little bit, switching to being a for-profit company. At that point, they gave the axe to Catherine McLean, Mendel Kaelin, and a couple other researchers, as I understand it. They switched to, I think the most troubling thing early on was that the FDA basically said in order to keep producing, they switched up the regulatory components for the phase 2 and 3 trials and said, whereas before they could use research grade psilocybin or MDMA, they said at this point you need to use GMP psilocybin, which is good manufacturing processes. It basically deals with being able to track every component of the medication that you're making, so fillers, capsules, the whole nine, so that should you need to do a recall, you can actually find out what went wrong. Well, MAPS sent COMPAS to a pharmaceutical company called Onyx after they'd had trouble with another pharmaceutical company, and COMPAS actually engaged in an exclusivity agreement with Onyx, so that when USONA, another organization that was looking, a nonprofit organization that was looking to make psilocybin available at cost, approached Onyx and said, hey, can you make psilocybin for us? Onyx said, well, actually, we've got this exclusivity deal with COMPAS. Now, COMPAS was nowhere near ready to start doing trials or anything like it, whereas the researchers USONA was going to be providing that psilocybin to were ready to go. And so essentially a bunch of US research institutions hemorrhaged money for a considerable period of time because COMPAS was looking to gain a competitive advantage. So I would contend there we have, for the first real time in psychedelic research, certainly in the psychedelic resurgence, as it's called, seeing capitalist dynamics actually interfering with research. Whereas before it was sort of everybody should get access to any of the compounds they need. Now it was all sorts of games about hamstringing the competition and creating problems. Compass is involved with Christian Angermeyer, who's also the guy behind Atai Life Sciences. These are people who, in looking at the strategies they're deploying, seemed very much focused on bringing a venture capital outlook to psychedelic medicines, to psychedelic therapies, and seem very much invested in maximizing profit for the long haul. Peter Thiel is involved in Compass, if you're not familiar with him. Let's see, some of the wonderful things he said. The last time for optimism in the US was the 1920s, the age of the robber barons. He decried women getting the vote. He's decried democracy. He has argued that if you want to have a successful business, the best way of doing that is to have a monopoly and not allow for competition. So when he makes that sort of statement and then Rick Doblin says, oh, but you don't have anything to worry about, Compass definitely isn't looking to create a monopoly, I think we have really big reasons to be concerned and to ask what's actually going on here and who's benefited, right? At the point where Compass is running around saying, hey, we've got all these great connections in the EU, and MAPS is looking at getting involved in doing MDMA therapy in the European Union. Again, I think that there's really significant reasons to question motivations. And like I mentioned, there's a zine in the back, the Open Science Reader, that's got a good bit on Compass.
I wanted to ask you what you think about the legalization or the legal treatment of these substances. So you mentioned cannabis, and that's a case where clearly the legalization brought up some issues and some of the complexity that you mentioned, but it still seems like it's a better thing that it's legal rather than it is not. What do you think?
Well, I think better is a really challenging construct. I think better raises the question of better for whom? I think one of the things I personally found really disturbing coming from NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, when John Boehner announced that he had switched his position on cannabis, coincidentally at the same time that he became a significant shareholder of Acreage Holdings, which was a cannabis VC fund. NORML gave this great celebratory announcement saying, we don't really care why John Boehner changed his politics. We don't care about the money attached. We're just excited he changed his politics because it's a step in the right direction. And yet at that moment in time, Boehner was essentially going to get fabulously wealthy off of a substance that tons of black, brown, and generally poor folks were still rotting in prisons for. And so I think that the way that some of these dynamics play out, like if we look at the way California has gone post-legalization, where I was always an advocate of legalization, full decriminalization, whatever, because I thought, gee, if we can just defund the war against folks who use cannabis, that sort of pulls the linchpin out of the war on some people who use certain drugs. And at the end of the day, what happened in California and elsewhere is that they created a whole regulatory patchwork where they figured out ways to keep certain acts illegal. So as long as you can break some law for cannabis, you still have funding for cannabis interdiction. It just looks a little bit different. And so I would say, I think seeing some of the states, I don't remember if Washington was one or not, that were looking to expunge records and release folks who had been incarcerated for cannabis. I think things like that are a great step in a right direction. But I think if we're talking about the dynamics of corporatization and capital that come into the space, who gets to participate in that, right? Like when people talk about voting with your dollars, that's for folks who have dollars in the first place. If you don't really have a voice, if you don't actually have a way of buying into the system or getting heard, I think there's really big questions about whether or not you can benefit from some of these things. I think probably most people here would agree that not locking people up for so-called drug crimes is a benefit. I certainly wouldn't argue against that. I think we have to ask questions about what else comes along with that. So when folks use this notion of accessibility, right, we should be pursuing a medical model because it increases access for folks. Well, if we're talking about $15,000 MDMA therapy at the point of expanded access clinics, that offers availability to a very small group of people, and certainly not the people that some of these therapists are saying really need this therapy. So you'll get someone who says, oh my God, we have all of these poor folks, these people who are being brutalized by these systems, and they absolutely need access, so stop decrying medicalization. But then you look at the realities of medicalization, or you look at ketamine clinics where folks are charging, what, $900 for some ketamine? Like, it's kind of nonsense. And I would say, similarly, I have concerns around commodification in peer groups, right? In the integration industry, in senses of, when you're charging people astronomical amounts of money to come smoke 5-MeO DMT with you, or come eat some mushrooms, or, personally, I suppose I'm less interested in some of what the particular legal codes look like, and more interested in the ways that we can self-organize, because I think our efficacy is greatest where we actually have agency and determination, or determinism, and I don't think we really have that in a lot of the political structures. And I think if people feel like pushing towards legalization, I think coalition building is a thing that can happen, and I think finding space for people who are interested in those sorts of legislative projects. I mean, looking at what happened in Denver, looking at what happened in Oakland, I'm certainly not decrying that, but also if we say, look at what happened in Oakland or Denver, I think we have real questions about, are people moving in to start selling or to start advertising low-key ceremonies because there's less threat of being prosecuted, and how does that play out? I think we should also ask questions if, and emphasis on if, I don't know that this is happening, but if the organizations that were involved in putting those legislative measures forward are now attempting to function as gatekeepers or leaders, if they're trying to say that other people should or shouldn't act in certain ways simply because they got the legislation passed or because they were the most visible actors in that moment, I think, again, that raises questions about how we organize and how we relate to each other as human beings. And I think at the crux of all of it, like, I'm interested in whatever sort of relations and actions allows for the greatest liberatory potential overall. And I think maybe there's some of that available in a legal frame. I would imagine even if we had full legalization, there's still going to be quite a bit of work to do.
Well, I guess there's many ways in which you can legalize something.
Huh?
Right? There are many ways in which you can legalize something, and hopefully we can learn from what happened to cannabis.
Yes, absolutely. And I think cannabis is really telling, looking at the myriads of problems that exist there and how many people have sort of fled the cannabis space precisely because all of a sudden the values that erupted there were so antithetical to their own.
Thank you for your talk. I was particularly moved by your conclusion where you dealt with sexual transgressions and with who you choose to work with. And in view of that, I wonder if you could speak to the case of Daniel Pinchbeck and your controversy with Via Labat.
Can you give a little background on that?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. I was told I don't have to either. I guess I can give some commentary. So the question was if I would speak to Pinchbeck and Via Labate. Daniel Pinchbeck is an author who has largely traversed New York scenes. He's been involved in the psychedelic space for a while. He wrote a book about 2012 and the return of Quetzalcoatl and the zeitgeist of the time, and was involved in an organization called Evolver. A number of people, women, had reported having reported him engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior. There had been posts on social media that appeared and disappeared, things that were apparently pressured to come down. Eventually, after quite a while, Pinchbeck, in the wake of Me Too, made a so-called "it was me" statement where he attempted to acknowledge some of his past transgressions. And I think perhaps most telling from that particular post was a statement I'm going to butcher it slightly, but essentially it was, to be clear, I've never engaged in non-consensual sex. What I have done includes behaviors such as, and there's a list of behaviors, and one of them was used substances as tools of seduction, which I found incredibly problematic, and a number of other people did as well. We had been vocal about our opposition to some of the organizations that were giving Pinchbeck a platform at the time. And the Third Wave, which was run by Paul Austin, who had a number of run-ins with various people in the psychedelic community as a result of a Twitter handle that was Paul Austin MD, despite the fact that he wasn't a doctor, advising people to microdose rather than maybe use some of their pharmaceuticals, if I recall correctly. A whole bunch of problematic behavior, but he was sort of proposing that he and Daniel Pinchbeck should do an event together because Pinchbeck was such a brilliant person and a voice that we need to listen to. One of his advisors made a post saying that they were leaving the Third Wave as a result of that. A group of other people raised concerns about Pinchbeck getting platformed like that, particularly when he was looking to advance a new book, perhaps putting out some more of his narrative around why some of his behaviors had been justifiable or okay, or how he's claiming to learn from them, but not learning in order to participate as a regular community member, but learning from them so that he can maintain some sort of position of power. That erupted in, eventually that event was canceled in less than 24 hours after it was announced because the entire staff or the majority of the staff of the Third Wave was really upset with that and ended up resigning as a result. That was a point where I think because Pinchbeck had such an established history and was so known for engaging in those problematic behaviors that it was actually a really easy thing for people to say, we know who this person is, we know what he's done, and we're actually not comfortable being part and parcel of that. So the Dr. Labate is someone who I've known for years. She and Chacruna, an online publication, decided that they wanted to engage in a conversation, an interview with Pinchbeck. I had requested that rather than doing that, they actually focus on the voices of his victims and survivors and maybe center those experiences rather than giving him another platform to promote his book and why he should be given access to the power and visibility of being up on stage or up centered in an article again. They went ahead and published the article. I questioned whether or not they were the best organization to engage in that, even if we put aside questions around platforming such people. I was told that I was lying about some of the questions that I had raised around the history of Chacruna and Pinchbeck, and after getting comments deleted repeatedly, I authored an article that was titled An Anti-Authoritarian Response to the Actions of Chacruna and Dr. Labate, which basically went through some of the really problematic engagements I'd had with Chacruna, including, you saw the slide with Will Sue earlier, and with Neil. I had actually had a number of arguments with Dr. Labate about whether or not it was appropriate for therapists to argue about condom use or engage in a bunch of the other problematic behavior they had. Personally, I was kind of surprised to have had those debates in the first place. I wasn't particularly thrilled about being called a liar, but at the point where somebody had challenged the veracity of the statements that I was making, I didn't know how to protect my own name and set the record straight short of sharing the actual correspondence. And so in that piece, which is available, it's hosted on a Google Drive. I think if you search for an anti-authoritarian response to Labate, you'll find it. I think it's linked on one of the psychedelic praxis Reddits or something. But The point being that like I included a preamble about my political orientations as an anti-authoritarian, as an anarchist. I shared my real hesitations and concerns around sharing personal correspondence, especially as somebody who's functioned in the underground for the last 13 years and whose the majority of my research and engagement with sanctioned researchers and folks underground has relied on my ability to keep my mouth shut. And yet, in that moment, it didn't really feel like I had any other option but to put some of that on the table, because I strongly believe that if we're not willing to put these behaviors front and center and say we've got a problem, as long as people are atomized and isolated and walled off and don't realize that this is happening to a bunch of people around them, these behaviors can continue to propagate. The people who are engaged in these behaviors rely on that silence and atomization. And frankly, to me, it felt more important to put that out there and have the broader community engage with that, even if it meant my own lack of access to sources and friends and contacts. If all that comes out of that is that if certain people in the future find themselves on the receiving end of abusive behavior and can see that it's not just them and they're not crazy, that's kind of good enough for me. So I know that that's still causing a lot of controversy. I know that some people are still very unhappy that's out there, but I think having seen friends and peers and people that I really respect having borne the burden of that behavior for far too long, that's just sort of how it played out.
Thank you for listening to our Town Hall Seattle Arts and Culture series. I'm Jenny Palmer. Our theme music comes from the Seattle-based band Ibu and Seattle's own Barsuk Records. A special thanks to our audio engineer, Jeff Larson.